Hey everyone, my name is Kennedy Judy, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about iron. Okay, so just to get started on some quick general information about iron, it is an essential mineral, which just means that our bodies aren't able to synthesize it on their own, so we need to obtain it through our diet. Going along with that, it's a trace mineral, which this means that it's just needed in very small amounts compared to other vitamins, minerals, and nutrients. Usually, trace minerals, the recommended values for those are between 1 and 100 milligrams. For iron, it's much less than that. It's usually only between like 1 and 30 milligrams at the most. That third point there is important, and I'll get into that later on. But iron is mostly known for its role in oxygen transport through the blood. Lastly, it's important to know that there are two groups of iron, heme and non-heme. So non-heme iron is found in both animal products and plant-based foods. And when I say animal products, I do mean like dairy products like milk and things like that too. However, heme iron is only found in the animal products. Heme iron is actually the largest source of dietary iron just because it's more readily absorbed by our bodies than non-heme iron is. So below that black line there, I have listed the RDA values for iron. Starting off with infants, they don't need very much when they're first born. They're still developing, but they're mostly getting that iron through the breast milk. It does kind of spike up between 6 months and 1 year to 11 milligrams a day, just because this is a really crucial developing period, so they need more iron for that cognitive development. Children's iron levels are pretty high, 1 to 3 years and 4 to 8 years, also to do with just because that's their developing period, so they need a pretty high amount of iron in order to make sure everything's being developed correctly. So if you look at the difference between the males and female values, you'll notice that the males stays pretty consistent throughout their life, and it's not nearly as high as the females is in the middle life years. Males, it's mostly 8 milligrams a day for most of their life, except for the 14 to 18 year time period, just to do with the development again. That's when a lot of them are going through puberty and developing, so they need more iron for that. Females in the 14 to 18 years age group, and also 19 to 30 years, and even 31 to 50 years, it's pretty high, also to do with development, but also in general, females just need more because we have menstrual cycles in which we are losing blood monthly, and so we need iron to be replenished since we're losing it. You'll notice underneath females, I've listed the pregnancy and lactation values, which are also generally pretty high. Pregnancy is 27 milligrams a day, just because you have to support your own body as well as the baby's body and their nutrient needs. So most of the time, women don't get all of this iron through their diet. They do usually have to take supplements. The upper limit for iron, actually, I was kind of surprised it's not that high. It's only 0 to 13 years is 40 milligrams a day, and everybody else 14 and on is 45 milligrams a day. Even though it doesn't seem like it's very high, it's really rare that people will go over that. Okay, so getting into the major functions of iron, as I previously mentioned, probably the biggest function of iron is that it's required for oxygen transportation in the blood. So iron makes up part of the protein molecule called hemoglobin in a red blood cell. Each hemoglobin has 4 heme groups, and each heme group can bind to 1 molecule of oxygen. So overall, each red blood cell can hold and transport 4 oxygen molecules at a Iron is also present in a molecule that's similar to hemoglobin. It's called myoglobin. Um, Myoglobin is important because it can bind to, store, and release oxygen needed for our muscles to function. So between hemoglobin and myoglobin, those two proteins contain 70% of our iron, of our body's total iron. So that's a good chunk of it. So it's definitely those are really important processes for our body to function. So lastly, iron actually does play a part in cognitive development. That's kind of why I mentioned in the last slide that children and teenagers and everybody, they kind of need a higher amount during those crucial developmental periods. This is just because iron basically helps create enzymes which in turn synthesize into neurotransmitters, which neurotransmitters are basically the backbone of cognitive development. They're the ones that do all those processes that are important for cognitive processes, I guess is the best way to say it. Okay, so there are actually a lot of food sources of iron. I listed several examples under each category, but I know that there's more. I would say the most prominent sources, though, are definitely the red meat and seafood, which is the categories that contain both heme iron and non-heme iron, but just a reminder that only heme iron can be found in the meat, not the plant-based foods. So also the plant-based foods, vegetables are another big source of it that contains non-heme iron. So there are actually a lot of kind of snack foods that obviously don't have natural iron in them. They're called fortified foods. A lot of cereals will be fortified with iron, as well as enriched rice and enriched bread. So during that enrichment process where they're putting certain nutrients that were lost back in, a lot of times there will be some iron in there. Okay, so conditions related to iron deficiencies. The biggest one is definitely iron deficiency anemia. There's like over 3 million cases just in the US alone a year usually. So it is a really common thing. So basically, iron deficiency anemia is just when the body isn't able to get enough iron, which in turn makes it so the body isn't making enough hemoglobin. So overall, there's not enough healthy red blood cells in the body to transport oxygen, which causes problems. So there are a few things that can cause us to not get enough iron. The first one is blood loss, whether you're giving blood or sick, or even just women with their menstrual cycles. If you're losing blood, blood has iron in it, and if you're not replenishing enough iron into your body, then you can get an iron deficiency. Secondly, a lot of people have conditions that make them unable to absorb iron. Iron is actually absorbed in the small intestine, and then it goes into the blood. So people with intestinal disorders, kind of like celiac disease, they're at risk for iron deficiency anemia. A lot of times, if this is the case, doctors recommend them to eat foods high in vitamin C or drink things high in vitamin C, just because vitamin C actually helps your body better absorb iron. So third is the most obvious, but also probably the most common. A lot of times people just aren't eating enough foods with iron in them. So since we can't synthesize iron on our own, and we rely on our body taking it in through our diets, if you're not eating enough, then that obviously can cause an iron deficiency. That last point is pretty important. Women who are pregnant are a lot of times at risk of iron deficiency anemia, just because they are living for two. They've got to meet their own nutrient needs. They've got to meet the baby's nutrient needs. and a lot of times they're not meeting that through just their diet consumption. So doctors also a lot of times will recommend supplements to pregnant women just to make sure that they're getting enough iron for them. So who's at risk? It kind of follows along with causes. Obviously, women are, because they can become pregnant and because they're losing blood every month through the menstrual cycle. Infants and young children are at risk, mostly just because they need a little bit more because they're developing. Also because they have to rely on their parents to make sure that they're eating foods that are rich in iron. And as we all know, sometimes kids are picky and they don't like certain foods, and so a lot of times they're just not getting enough foods with iron in them. Vegetarians are at a risk as well, just because a lot of the iron actually comes from meat. And if they're not eating it, and if they're not getting enough iron through plant-based foods, then they're at a risk for iron deficiency anemia. Also going along with blood loss, frequent blood donors are at risk just because if they're not replenishing the iron that they're losing when they're getting blood, then that will cause a deficiency. I've also included a picture just to showcase some of the signs and symptoms of someone with iron deficiency anemia. A lot of the things are pretty similar. They'll be fatigued, they'll feel shortness of breath just because they're not getting enough oxygen throughout their body. They'll get headaches, they're really sensitive to the cold, they'll lose their hair, and their nails will be brittle. Okay, so kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum here, iron toxicity is possible. It's not really rare, especially through just consuming too much iron in the diet. Most people aren't. So the number one cause of iron poisoning would be just abusing supplements and vitamins that contain iron in them. Adults can overdose. It has happened before, but most of the time the victims are children, just because they don't really know any better. They think the vitamins look like candy or they taste good, and the mom's not looking, so they take a whole bunch at one time. So most of the time they are the victims with iron poisoning. So some of the signs and symptoms of iron poisoning, since it corrodes the intestinal lining, it will cause things like diarrhea, which will lead to dehydration. It also can cause vomiting, which a lot of times there's blood in the vomit as well in the stool, and then of course abdominal pain. So the best thing that most people recommend to prevent this is just to keep your vitamins and other supplements away from children, so that they can't get them when you're not looking and take a whole bunch at one time. Okay, so now moving on to iron's role in the metabolic pathway. It does have important role in cellular respiration, just because there are certain heme iron groups that form proteins called cytochromes. And cytochromes are proteins that actually carry electrons through the electron transport chain, which we've learned that the electron transport chain creates ATP, which is a very important energy source for our body. And down there, I've just included a diagram as a reminder of the electron transport chain that occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. Okay, just kind of a fun, interesting fact that I learned that I really had no idea about before I researched this, is that the iron oxygen bond in hemoglobin is what actually causes your blood to be red in color. All right, another interesting thing that I found while looking for current news events about iron, there were a lot of articles that just talked about how using cast iron cookware could help prevent iron deficiency without having to change your diet at all or add supplements. I've included the links to the studies that were mentioned in this article. But basically, there was a study done on children who were at risk for iron deficiency, And they found that cooking certain foods with cast iron cookware raised the iron content of those foods by 16.2%, which resulted in a 7.9% increase of hemoglobin in children. So overall, they thought it was pretty successful at preventing iron deficiency. As I mentioned, the pros about this, if it does work for you, a lot of people kind of are in favor of it just because they don't want to make changes to their diet, and they don't want to take supplements either. So just by cooking with cast iron, it could up your iron intake enough that hopefully you won't have to worry about a deficiency. Okay, so just kind of end things, some things that I want to remember and then I want you to remember. Number one is definitely that iron is essential for the body to transport oxygen in the blood. We talked about hemoglobin. That's just a really, really important process for us to function. We also briefly mentioned that iron helps in cognitive development and function. Also, that it's a part of the metabolic process by creating proteins that carry electrons through the electron transport chain, and this creates ATP. I'm going to kind of skip the next one, but always make sure that children are supervised when taking vitamins and supplements. I think that's an important thing to take away, just because we mentioned iron poisoning is really common in young children. And so I think that that it has many food sources, and the last one, eating a well-balanced diet, will help you meet your iron needs, kind of go together, just because it really is found in a lot of foods, and we really don't need too much iron, but a lot of people aren't getting enough. So just by eating a well-balanced diet, that will help you a lot meeting your iron needs. All right, everybody, thanks so much for watching, and here are my references for the information.